It's a hot day here in London, and I'm telling you, there's some hot action on the chessboard as well. We're into round 3 of the Fide World Cup, this grand knockout tournament taking place in Sochi. And I want to report on the tiebreak in the match between Anish Giri and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Abdusattorov, just 16 years old, from Uzbekistan, a real talent. He's been marked out as something special for years, and, well, he's coming good. But let's see how he got on in this tiebreak. First 2 classical games between the players were drawn. Tough fights, actually. And this is the first of the 2 25-minute rapid play tiebreak games. In fact, Abdusattorov had played a superb technical endgame as black. And here he played h5, an excellent move, a very, very tricky move. Lots of captures available for white, none of them particularly good. Giri played knight takes h5, then rook d1, so just threatening to check and then push the pawn. King takes, now knight takes pawn check, and d2. The rook came behind the pawn, but now knight f1 protects the pawn, and then the rook can just move away, and or e1, and it's going to be a queen on the next turn. Wow, what a start. So Giri won down and went into the second rapid play game in a must-win situation. And of course, he had the black pieces. Not easy against someone like Abdusattorov, who, well, he's pretty well schooled. He knows his theory very well, and you know he can play pretty solidly when required. So, what would Giri play in this must-win situation? Well, he played an opening that I can't recall him playing before, but an opening that keeps a lot of tension in the position. The so-called Old Indian. Instead of playing with g6, bishop e7. So, you know, there's not so much kind of hot theory on these positions. You have to feel your way through. And, well, white has a nice space advantage. Abdusattorov played d5 here. You don't have to close the position immediately. You can play moves like rook e1 and bishop back to f1, but that's a solid way to play. You know, you claim your space advantage, and it's perhaps less easy for black to get all that kind of King's Indian play on the king side. But anyway, it's a very tense position. The knight, of course, seizes the chance to get into c5 and a5. So that knight, for the moment, is pretty secure on c5. So that's a nice position to be in. Bishop e3, targeting the knight. Queen c7. Now, white has to watch out for tactics on the c file. And actually, already, this is a slightly tricky position for white. So, for example, if h3, then here's the tactic. Takes here and then pin and win. More on pin and win later. So you can see there's a pin here. And black wins a pawn. Now, knight d2 is perhaps the most solid move to protect that pawn, and also kind of guards against knight g4 as well. That could just be exchanged off. But Abdusattorov played a3. Now, that is a really ambitious move. White wants to push forward with b4 and just drive that knight away. Now, if pawn takes pawn, well, once again, we don't play like this because of the pin, but e takes, and you can see that white can use that square, and this isn't so clear, actually. You know, white certainly has decent play there. But Giri decided to play knight g4 to get at that bishop. Of course, if the bishop drops back, then pawn to f5. So bishop takes knight, so that is already a very committal decision. So to some extent, extent that damages black's pawn structure, but you can see that this bishop now has no opponent. And if that bishop enters the game, then things could get quite tricky for white. So let's see, knight e1, but it's really in the balance, this position. Knight e1, the knight went back to f6, and knight d3, looking at both those pawns. Now bishop d7, that's a very nice waiting move for black, actually. Well, waiting move is actually the wrong term, because that bishop looks at the b5 square, and it's going to support potentially a push to b5 a bit later. And at this moment, Abdusattorov thought for around about 3 minutes, and I'm not surprised he felt as though he had to invest the time here. Remember, it's a 25-minute game, because black already has strategic threats here. Basically, black wants to take, and after c takes, play b5 and c4 and get that bishop going, and that is already very dangerous. I was wondering here about pawn takes pawn on c6, because if pawn takes, then we can put the knight here on a4 to attack the pawn on c5. And if bishop takes, then maybe we spin that knight back and just put a rook on d1. The d4 square is covered. I think white should be okay there. Remember, white only needs to draw. Abdusattorov only needs to draw in this position. But he played b3, hoping to hold up black's queenside pawns. But let's see what happened. Pawn takes pawn, and now b5. There we go. Those pawns starting to advance. Knight b2. And this is a really crunch situation in the game. If black gets it wrong here, then white can be strategically winning. For example, after rook. So this pawn is attacked by knight and bishop. If rook b8, then a4. If b4, then, well, this is already, I would even say, a technically winning position for white once the knight reaches c4. Or pawn takes pawn, knight takes. I mean, I think it's a better way for black to play. Nevertheless, this position is very secure for white. You can see really control over those light squares. That's really nice. So this is black's problem. You have to react quickly, but Giri did. He played c4, and actually in these kind of positions, that's a really thematic move, an absolutely typical move. You give up this pawn, you don't recapture, but you push on with b4, with that bishop potentially entering in on c5. And in that way, that bishop enters on the dark squares. Here, white is still probably okay. The computer indicates that after this is still playable for white. The difference is there's going to be no pin on the A file. I'll show you. We'll compare and contrast in a second. So this was a mistake from Abdusattorov, because now rook a5, and this is extremely uncomfortable. It is very hard for white to escape from this situation. So there's a lot of scrambling going on. Bishop d1 to protect that. Rook here, you can see that is a very nasty pin. Queen d3 played. Bishop coming into those dark squares. Bishop b3, h6, just holding firm for a moment. Queen c2, queen a7, increasing the pressure, and also putting some pressure on the f2 pawn. And this is pretty nasty already. Not a pleasant position for white to play. Remember, it's a rapid play game. Not so much time to contemplate how you're going to try and squeeze out of this. It's really difficult. h3, bishop d4. So another pin. And you can see what incredible pressure there is. You know, it feels like white is going to crack here. Rook a2. And here, well, do you know what? Giri thought for over 5 minutes on one move here. And I suspect that he was looking for some clean, clear knockout punch. It looks like there should be one here. And perhaps he was frustrated that he couldn't find something that killed the game off completely. For example, here, bishop takes. This does look to be a very strong move, actually. Bishop takes. Now, if knight takes, then black wins a piece. So queen takes, bishop takes a4, rook a1. You know, maybe he wasn't sure about this kind of position. It's a counter pin here. But in fact, this is still good for black after this move. So lots of tricky tactics here. Now, black is not winning a piece. However, this endgame with this beautiful knight and these squares all controlled by black. Now the king can come into the middle to blockade, and then you start pushing. It must be winning for black, but you know, it's very hard to foresee those tricky tactical variations, to calculate them accurately and to judge them accurately as well. So Giri obviously couldn't find something to his satisfaction and just dropped the rook back to a6, so that hesitation let Abdusattorov back in, rook a1, which looks really ugly because it's a self pin, but actually it does help. After rook c8, now again it gets very tricky and very tactical. Knight c3, stepping away. Again, it's the kind of move that is very hard to calculate. So well, in fact, the best move for black is to play here. And then to take here. Again, this is so tricky to calculate. You know, this is a computer variation, and it thinks that black is still better here. But instead, Giri played rook a3, which also doesn't look bad. In fact, this is the best move for white here. Abdusattorov played knight d3. So if bishop takes knight, for example, then rook takes and queen takes, and it seems that white is just about in the game there. But Giri played excellently now. Knight takes e4. Another pin. And bishop takes rook. So now he's the exchange ahead, but those pawns are now rolling. But here he missed a good move. Bishop f5. And that does look like it gives black pretty good winning chances, although it's still very messy. But rook takes. Queen takes. Rook a8. Attacking the bishop. Should still be better for black, but you can see it's getting really tricky with those two connected pawns in the middle of the board. But here, definitely the best chance was to check. And now there are some tactics. Very hard to see these kind of things when you're short of time. And Giri was down on the clock. Here's the tactic. Takes, and if knight takes, rook c1. And you win one of the pieces back, and then it should be winning for black. But you know, that kind of thing, really hard to see. As I said, particularly when you're down to under a minute. But you do get 10 seconds each time you make a move, nevertheless. Very hard. And once again, this was a missed opportunity for black. b3, again, it's all about tactics. And tactics are really hard to calculate when you're short of time. Because, you know, you can waste time looking at somehow very unnatural moves. And if they don't work, then, yeah, it's just a waste. So, for example, here, should be winning for black. Even this, you know, could still be tricky, but should be winning. But at this point, Giri lost his nerve because he took the knight and then played rook d8, falling back and basically preventing this pawn from advancing. But this is passive. King e2, and it is, well, how does black make progress now? Basically, white threatens just to bring that king over, scoop the pawn, and bring the king in. So basically, black has to take here to get rid of the pawns. So Giri was hoping that with rook and 2 pawns against bishop and knight, he might still have some winning chances. But actually, white has control in the center with those minor pieces. You can see that pawn can't advance. There's a secure blockade. Now, at the moment, of course, it would be a terrible blunder for white to do this. Then black wins a piece. But white is certainly not obliged to take that pawn. But now it's a case of whether Giri can make anything of his kingside pawn majority, this 4 against 3 on the king side, and then bring the rook into the position. So, for example, well, here we go. h4 played, and f5. Obviously, that can't be captured because of king takes bishop. Now, h5. So, Abdusattorov just fixing those pawns. And here looks like a decent try is to play rook c8 and then bring the rook in. I suspect this is still equal, but, you know, that's a chance for black. But f4 played. And this is very instructive how Abdusattorov played. Now, I mean, one thing is this, well, he could still go for rook c8 here. So knight e1, and this brings the knight around here. Rook c8 is still possible. But king e7, knight f3, so that means that the king can't go to g5, and the knight keeps tabs on that pawn. And now he's just trying to shut out black's rook, and Giri can't find a way through, so that they're just shuffling over the last few moves. But here Giri realized with his time running out, and well, there's a danger of a threefold repetition actually, he thought now is the moment to plunge in with the rook. But actually white is very well set up here, and watch what happens. This is very peculiar position. So Giri manages to take that pawn on h5. He still has rook and 2 extra pawns, but this is a very curious kind of Zugzwang position actually. And in fact white is now winning, because if the rook tries to move away to get those pawns rolling, then simply knight takes pawn. And that's really dangerous. And otherwise the rook can't move. You can't get the pawns going. If g5, then you can take here. Basically, it's kind of Zugzwang. And Abdusattorov realized that all he had to do was wait. King takes g7. In fact, it's possible just to take this pawn here. But again, Abdusattorov realizes he actually doesn't need to do anything here. So he waited and just repeated. You could even play bishop h3 here to shut the rook out completely, but well, he just waited. And here Giri, in a must-win situation, went for it with rook h1, allowing knight takes pawn. Now, this was why the bishop was kept on c6, because he realized that he can keep his king in this wonderful position on d6, and it can support the e-pawn running through. So just shielding the king beautifully. h5, but now white just pushes home. Black's pawns aren't even in this race. e6, e7, and knight e5 just cuts out the rook. Those minor pieces do a wonderful job in the middle of the board, supported by the king. There you go. Control of the center, and the pawn queens on the next turn. Incredibly tense game. I think, you know, there were moments where I think Abdusattorov, certainly from the opening, lost his way. allowing this advanced c4 was, well, it handed a really golden opportunity to Giri. But Giri, I don't know, he seemed to be moving very slowly and just failed to capitalize. And then later on, it got pretty random. But credit to Abdusattorov, who played very quickly, moved really quickly. And that really rattled Giri. And he just couldn't make anything of his advantage. So there we go. Anish Giri is knocked out of the World Cup in the 3rd round. Congratulations to Nodirbek Abdusattorov. I'm going to have to practice that. Who goes through. And he faces Nodirbek from Azerbaijan in the next round. So I think it's a reasonable pairing for him. So there we go. Don't forget, merch sale at the moment on the PowerPlayChess shop, online shop. So all merch, 20% off. Check out the discount code in the video description, and also you'll see it in the comments as well. So for example, your favorite Octopus Knight merch is on sale there. You can get t-shirts, mugs, and the new design pin and win as well. So, and yeah, if you get some merch, don't forget, post a photo on social media, on Twitter or on Instagram, and I'll repost. There you go. Thanks for watching.